but it became a matter of will, right? It became a battle of wills rather than a genuine concern for the person that you love. I mean, it didn't help when it became the focus of national attention. Became a very political and emotional battle that dived right into the culture wars in our country. So, but the take-home message is that you've got these disorders of consciousness and they move up and down. Yes?
I went to a lecture by Dr. Paul Byrne, and he was saying brain dead is not really dead, and about 30% of the people that are brain dead, they're declared brain dead, they're really like in a coma, and it's an economic concern because the ones that they want, particularly for a brain dead, are young people, ones that are teenagers or in their 20s, and they're more easily declared brain dead. And then they go harvest their organs. They prepare the body for harvesting. But he said that when they go to tests, like you talked about the doctors testing.
Apnea tests and all of that.
Yeah, he said that they pick the tests, like say there are 17 tests, they'll pick like say 5 of them that most likely people are going to show to be brain dead when they're not really. Like they're more likely to be like you're passing the brain dead test, and if you did all 17, you wouldn't?
Well, brain death is such a big topic. You know, it's like a completely separate. I could talk for another hour on brain death. But let me just say this with brain death. There are certainly, it's a very complicated and complex diagnosis. Now, the diagnostic criteria have changed and evolved over time. There are different criteria for a child who may be declared brain dead versus someone who is an adult, only because the infant brain is much more malleable and much more open to healing than, say, a brain of an adult. Now, there are also criteria now where they simply take the patient into an MRI machine and they look, is there any blood flow into the brain? And the presupposition is, if the brain isn't getting any blood, well, nothing can happen then. I mean, the brain is dead because the brain has been starved to death. So there's certainly numerous disputes over the appropriate criteria for brain death. The second thing is, brain death is not simply an argument about brain death, it's a debate about organ transplantation at the same time. So you can never separate the discussion of brain death with the discussion over organ transplantation, because James Burnett, for example, who has argued about brain death, will say, we agree that the brain death criteria is probably erroneous, but we're not going to change it. Because we're not going to change it, because if we're going to change it, what's going to happen to all those patients who need organ transplant? So the debate is much, much, much more complex than that, right? So, but I acknowledge your point. One of the difficulties is that this debate is associated with politics and economics, and also, and I think we have to put this in mind, a genuine, maybe confused, but a genuine desire on many physicians to care for their patients. I mean, we have to acknowledge it's not that we've got doctors, because I know doctors, they're not going out simply to be Frankensteins to harvest organs. They have a genuine concern for their patients, and they know that the only way that their patient is going to survive is if that patient gets an organ transplant. Now, many of them have never engaged in the philosophical discussion over the appropriateness of one criteria or another, and so what ends up happening is they just do what they can. And so we have to acknowledge that it's a very complicated, very complex discussion. Now, how then do we care for patients with disorders of consciousness? Well, I'd like to suggest there's nothing to care for someone with a severe disorder of consciousness is not much different than caring for someone who is fully conscious. And there's several principles that I'm just going to remind you of because they were brought up in the last discussion about extraordinary care and ordinary care. First of all, your life, my life, and our health are good for us. They are gifts from God, from a theological perspective. And therefore, we have a responsibility, in fact, a great privilege, to care for these goods. And we have to therefore avail ourselves of all the ordinary means to care for them, for our life and our health. However, this is important, especially this week in the light of the resurrection, we have to acknowledge that this life, the life that we are living now, is not the end all of everything. I can't wait to get my glorified body. You know, I tell my students that I'm going to be 33 years old for all eternity with a glorified body that's going to be able to go through walls. I'm like, isn't that cool? I tell them, isn't that cool? Now, when you're looking forward to that, right, what's this? All right, so that's just a theological perspective. But realistically speaking, we are all aware we're going to die. And so a time will come when we have to acknowledge that death is inevitable. And at that point, we make the distinction between ordinary care and extraordinary care. And extraordinary care, this distinction is not a medical one. So often my students will assume that an aspirin is ordinary care, and that induced pluripotent stem cells is extraordinary care. And that is not the case. Sometimes an aspirin may constitute extraordinary care. Because the difference between ordinary and extraordinary care is a moral difference. It's not a scientific one. And it has to do with burden. It has to do with excessive burden. If you find that this care is excessively burdensome for you, and the previous speaker was discussing the differences between that, if you find that it's excessively burdensome, then you can forego or stop that treatment. Now, this is going to depend on the individual. I'll give you a story. When I was a young dad is a priest in his first year. I don't know if you know that. So I was a young dad, ordained about 2 months. And I was sent to the Upper East Side of Manhattan, the New York Cornell Presbyterian Hospital. And there was a patient there who was on, basically she was intubated. And she was intubated, and the intubation was difficult because she couldn't communicate with her family. But her daughter was getting married. And as she said she was going to live, she was going to do everything possible to make it to her daughter's wedding. So until then, everything was ordinary care. Her daughter got married. We had a wedding cake in the hospital. After that, she said, you know, I'm ready to go. She said, I want to say my goodbyes. I cannot say my goodbyes now because I've got a tube down my throat. And so she then, now notice, it's the same technology. But before the wedding, it was ordinary care. After the wedding, she said, look, it's excessively burdensome because I'm ready to go and I want to say my goodbyes to my loved ones. So she then made the decision that it was extraordinary care. They removed the tube. She was able to say goodbyes to her family. Love, kisses, tears, laughter, crying.